Thank you. I'm just waiting for my slides. There they are. They're so big. So yeah, my talk is called There Is No Spoon, Understanding Spoon Theory and Preventing Burnout. I want to introduce myself really fast. My name is Jamison Hampton. You can call me Jamie. I'm here from Buffalo, New York, the home of bad sports. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first DevOps Days conference, and I've been wanting to come to one for quite some time. So I'm really happy. We're having our first one in Buffalo in September, so I'm excited about that too. I'm representing my company. We're called Artemis. We're an agricultural startup from Brooklyn that does farm management and data analysis for greenhouses, and we're hiring Rails and React engineers, so just throwing that out there. And I'm also representing Greater Than Code. That's the podcast that I'm on. If you haven't heard of it, I think it's pretty cool. It's a tech podcast that's kind of focused on the human side of things. And you can find me on Twitter at Jamie Bash. This talk I actually do kind of another introduction. This is something that I'm going to talk about more later, but I just kind of want to get it out of the way to talk about it first. But again, I'm Jamie. I'm transgender. Specifically, I'm non-binary. And if you don't know what that means, for me at least, it kind of means three things mainly. Number one, I don't really identify as either a man or a woman. Number two, I use they or he pronouns, so please keep that in mind if you want to tweet about me or talk about my presentation or whatever. And number three, I have great hair. But what I really want to talk about is spoon theory. We're going to kind of get back into all of this, and it's all going to relate. But what is spoon theory? Maybe you've heard of it. I've been giving this talk for a couple of years, and at first, when I first started, most people hadn't really heard of it. Now sometimes they're like, oh yeah, I know about that. But it's a social metaphor that talks about how much energy we have in a day. It was coined in 2003. A woman named Christine Miserandino, she has lupus, came up with this metaphor to describe what it feels like to live with chronic illness. And so the spoons are the unit of measurement. Once I use energy to do something, then I've spent that spoon. And the key to spoon theory is that you have a finite number of them. You have only so much energy, and you have to kind of decide what you're going to use it for. And I guess the other kind of key here is that different people are affected by this in different ways. And so an example that I like to use is if you have a disability, there may be some things that you just can't do at all. For instance, if you're a full-time wheelchair user and you can't, and you don't walk at all, then you can't take the stairs. You just can't, and you would need accessibility accommodations. And of course, nobody in their right mind is going to go up to someone in a wheelchair and be like, well, why don't you just take the stairs? And if they did that, everyone would be like, wow, what a jerk. But it's not always as obvious as that. So here's an example. What if someone you knew had a prosthetic leg? And so sometimes you'd seen them take the stairs before, but then on another day, they couldn't do it. It's possible you don't even know that they have a prosthetic. And then it might be much more tempting for you, well, why can't you just take the stairs? I saw you do it before. But you don't actually know how difficult it might be for that person and how much energy they're expending to do that. So the key here is basically you can't know how many spoons somebody else has just by looking at them. And I did mention that it was finite, and that kind of implies that you can run out. So what happens when you run out? Well, they're gone, and then you don't have any more energy. It sounds obvious. Sometimes you can borrow some extra spoons from yourself, from your future self, like a payday loan. But there's consequences to that. And the example that I like to use is video games, because I like video games. And a lot of them have this mechanic. This is from Stardew Valley, which is one of my favorite games, because I do farming all day at my job, and then I do it in games. And but as you can see, you have this little energy bar in the corner, and so you wake up and it's green, and you're doing your chores, and then you're, fighting slimes in the mine or whatever, and you have a little bit less, and later in the day you have less. And then it's evening, and you're almost out of energy. You're having a drink at the bar. And so at this point in the game, you can do two things. You can go home and go to bed, and then you'll wake up the next day, and your energy bar will be at green again. Or you can keep doing stuff, and it'll let you go below the bottom of the little energy counter. But then when you wake up the next day, you don't have all of it. You only have some. And that's like a burden, because you probably have a lot of chores on the farm to do. So who am I talking about here? Who does spoon theory affect? I think everyone can benefit from an understanding of spoon theory because it's a great communication tool. Christine Miserandino in her essay talks about how healthy people have an unlimited number of spoons. I don't think that's actually true because spoons are energy and everyone has a limited amount of energy, but like a lot of people can get through an average day without having to ration it, and that's kind of what she was getting at. But that's why I think it's like important for everyone to understand, like people who are suffering from some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, and also people that aren't, because it gives you a shared language. And I'm going to be talking a lot about different kinds of illness, and that's like a really difficult thing to discuss. It's really hard to like go to your boss or whatever and be like, you know, my illness is acting up. Here's all the things about it. But if everyone understands this metaphor of spoon theory, it's easier to be like, oh, you know, I'm running low on spoons today, and then that's meaningful. It gives you a greater empathy for other people because it forces you to think about what they might be going through. And it gives us all a better understanding of our own limits, which I think is important for everybody too. I'm also going to talk about kind of a couple different groups. Again, this was originally designed to discuss like chronically ill and disabled people in that community. The mental illness community has also adopted spoon theory pretty heavily as like a communication strategy. And additionally, I also think it's a good way to describe kind of how it feels to be a member of a marginalized group and the discrimination that comes along with it. So I'm going to talk about all three of these things. So the first one, again, is physical illness and disability. This is obvious maybe, but constant pain is exhausting. It makes everything hard. We do a lot of things every day that we don't think about, but if you have a condition with chronic pain, everything becomes very hard. I personally wouldn't call myself like disabled, but I do have like a chronic back pain problem that like flares up, and it's just enough for me to realize like how much I'm taking for granted when that's not happening, and I can like tie my shoes without being in pain. And being worried about your health is also very exhausting. Additionally, when you have like reduced mobility, you have decreased accessibility to places. It makes it harder to do daily activities. You're spending more energy and time doing that. And healthcare can like help you, but it can also make you feel very weak. Like if you think of someone who's like going through chemo, that's very important, but it's taking up a lot of their spoons while that's happening. I'm going to talk about mental illness, which is a lot similar in many ways to the previous slide because like mental illness is chronic illness, but society doesn't really treat it the same, so I think it's worthwhile to kind of talk about it a little bit differently too. Again, it feels obvious, but constant emotional distress is also exhausting. It's just like hard to be very stressed out and anxious and having issues all the time. When I say being told to get over it, it's kind of what I was getting at when I said that society doesn't categorize mental illness the same way. A lot of people treat it as this thing that you should like pull yourself up out of instead of like a disease of the brain, which it is. So being told to get over it is a huge burden because it like takes the burden and puts it back on you to be like minimize your own struggling, and that's really difficult. And it can also cause imposter syndrome, like people second-guessing their like right to be sick, because if people act like you're faking or you should get over it for long enough, you can internalize that and feel like maybe it's some sort of failure on your part. And additionally, this can also be very physical too. I suffer from panic disorder, and when I get panic attacks, it's like one of the most physically exhausting things that happens to me ever in my life. Like I'm hyperventilating, I'm feeling nauseous, maybe I'm getting sick, I can't breathe, and my heart's racing. It looks really scary to someone who doesn't know what it is. I've had people try to like call ambulances for me and stuff, but like when people think about mental illness, it can also be very physical. And again, marginalized group is less common to apply spoon theory to, but I think that it really, really works. Because it turns out that being discriminated against sucks really bad. And when you experience discrimination every day, you're starting your day from a place of fatigue, and that's kind of what spoon theory is all about. It's exhausting to watch the news every day and hear bad news, which I think is like true for a lot of people, but it can be so much worse for people in marginalized groups. You're seeing like laws getting passed to discriminate against you. You're seeing like hate crimes happening to people in your community. It's really hard. And then people kind of expect you to talk about minority issues, even if it's like overwhelming, you don't really want to talk about it. You have to justify your existence to people. Particularly for me as a non-binary person, this happens all the time because not everyone knows what it means to be non-binary, and like that's not their fault. And so I like to try to help people understand, but sometimes I'm doing that with a subtext that kind of feels like, oh, well, if I don't do a good enough job explaining it, then they're not going to accept it, and then they're not going to like accept me and my identity. So it feels like I'm begging for people's approval a lot of the time. In microaggressions, I've given like whole talks about this, so I'll try not to spend too much time on it. But I think of microaggressions as like mosquito bites. These are like small things that people might say that like if they happen once, it's annoying, but when it happens over and over, it becomes really hurtful. This is often things that people don't mean any harm. They don't realize that they're being hurtful, but it still compounds in that way. So here are a couple examples. You don't sound black. Hopefully we can all agree that that's like not an okay thing to say to someone. Well, you don't look transgender, which is like feels a little similar to me, like, well, what do you want me to look like? This one I've seen like to people who come from different backgrounds, like, well, where are you from? Like, well, I'm from Chicago. Oh, but where are you really from? Like, Chicago. This one I wrote in relation to a lesbian couple. So which one of you is the guy in your relationship? Neither of us. That's what lesbians mean. And this is like for if you see like a woman at a tech conference and someone will be like, oh, are you an engineer? Like, maybe you could just assume that I'm an engineer. And I think the reason that the mosquito bite metaphor works so well is that not everyone gets bit by mosquitoes at the same rate. So like getting one mosquito bite might just be annoying, but being covered in mosquito bites is like really awful. For me as a trans person, getting misgendered is the biggest offender. Like people don't mean anything by it, they just don't know. Someone on the street doesn't know what my pronouns are, and they're not trying to be hurtful, but it still whittles away at my spoons, at my energy. So I want to do an exercise. I find this really helpful actually, to kind of go through a morning as like pretending like we're different people and see how energy gets spent. So this is like my control group, like an average morning, an average person. We get up, we're getting ready, we're going to work, we're commuting on the subway. It's not overly difficult. You might lose a spoon on the ordeal. Maybe you stayed out really late last night at the rooftop bar and you had a hard time getting up. Maybe the subway was crowded. Maybe the elevator was out at your job and you had to take the stairs and that was kind of a pain because you're out of shape. So you might spend like a spoon or two on this. But overall, like it's pretty much you've got your morning routine under control. But like think about what doing all of those things would be like if you are chronically ill. Like if you have a condition with chronic pain. First of all, you start out with less in the morning because you didn't sleep well last night because you were in pain. You're getting out of bed, it hurts to sit up, you're getting dressed, you're getting ready, you're in pain the whole time, it's taking twice as long as when you're not having pain flare-ups. Maybe you have a whole bunch of medications to take, maybe they make you feel a little sick, but you're kind of used to it. Maybe you're almost out and you're feeling stressed because you're not sure when you're gonna get back to the doctor to refill your script. So you're definitely spending a spoon on at least one on all of that. Like I said, the subway is crowded, you get jostled around a lot, it's really painful. You don't get a seat because it's crowded, but since you don't look obviously disabled to like a stranger, nobody thinks to give up their seat for you. I mentioned that the elevator at your job was broken. Climbing the stairs is really hard for you, but you don't know what else to do because you need to get there. So it takes you 20 minutes to climb the stairs. You have to take a rest halfway through. You're pretty much at the limit of your pain threshold already, even in the morning because you had to do this. And you're late for work, so you don't get coffee. And you have extra work piled up, partially because you were late, partially because you had a doctor's appointment earlier in the week that you had to take a half day for. So basically, to get to the same part of your day, as you can see, you have much less spoons left than in the control example. It's the nightmare world. We're just going to keep doing the same warning. Now we're going to talk about I'm going to talk about mental illness. Specifically, I'm going to talk about like anxiety and panic disorder. These things are different for different people depending on what kinds of, what exact situations are, but I'm going to kind of stay in my lane and talk about the ones that I really know. You're also starting with less in this morning because you had a panic attack last night and you went way over your capacity for energy. So you're starting with less. You wake up, all of these feelings from having a panic attack kind of feels like a really bad hangover. Keep in mind that also clinical depression is linked to like a whole list of other mental illnesses, so it's really common to be dealing with at least sporadic depression like additionally. When I'm having a bad anxiety day, getting out of bed and getting ready can be a real challenge, not like being tired and not wanting to get up, but this like intense, inexplicable fear of leaving my bedroom. But that's not really something you can normally call off work for, so in this scenario, you're gonna push through. A crowded subway is also terrifying when my anxiety is bad. Your heart starts racing every time someone bumps into you. You feel like you're starting to panic. On really, really bad days, it's possible you'll even feel some paranoia that like people around you are tracking or following you somehow, which even if you logically know that that's ridiculous, it still feels very scary. By the time you get to work, you're already worked up and feeling nauseous. Anxiety compounds like that. Once you're experiencing it, even things that would normally be fine will make it worse. Now you're freaked out, you're overanalyzing the tone that people use to say hi to you. Having a panic attack yesterday also makes you more susceptible to having another one today because of a thing that I think is really stupid but is real called secondary anxiety, which basically means that like I'll work myself up like, oh, I don't want to have a panic attack. Oh, it would be so horrible if I had a panic attack. Oh, that would be so awful. And then it like causes it to happen because I'm so stressed out that it might happen. And actually, if you work yourself all the way up and then have a panic attack, it's pretty much game over. I can't really do anything at that point. Like I have to sleep before I can do anything else. One more in our Groundhog Day, and then we're done. Now you're a member of a marginalized community. Again, I'm going to talk about being trans because it's what I know. You probably start out with all your spoons, so that's good at least. You get up and get ready. Maybe you woke up in a pretty good mood, but then you're brushing your teeth, and when you look in the mirror, you feel like you don't really recognize the person that's looking back at you. Gender dysphoria is kind of hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it, but I try to ask people to imagine, like, what if you woke up and you were suddenly like the opposite gender that you've been your whole life? Everything would feel wrong. Every time you saw your reflection, every time you heard your own voice, it would be jarring and wrong. So that's kind of difficult. You take the subway, you get catcalled, someone calls you a freak, doesn't feel good. You get misgendered 4 times by people who aren't trying to be jerks, they just don't know any better, that still doesn't feel good. You're reading the news, they passed a bill recently that takes rights away from trans kids in schools. Oh, and also a trans woman of color was murdered in your city over the weekend. So now, in addition to just not feeling good, you're feeling nervous about the people around you. You get to work, the receptionist misgenders you, even though you've told them a million times. You correct them and they make a comment about how being trans is the only thing that you ever talk about. But again, it's really jarring every time someone gets it wrong, so it's really hard not to think about. Now you're at work, you feel like you have to work harder and speak louder in order to get noticed for anything, which means you're using more spoons to get the same amount of work done, which incidentally is something that all women in the tech industry have to deal with. So as you can see, privilege is a factor here. Nobody has unlimited energy. Nobody is the Terminator. There's always going to be times in everyone's lives when you're dealing with stuff that forces you to spend more spoons. Maybe you're healthy, but your mom has been in the hospital, and you're really worried about her, and you've been taking care of her. Maybe you had a newborn recently, and you haven't slept through the night in 3 months. These are definitely things that require more spoons. But the difference here is that A, most of these kinds of things are temporary, and B, someone in these other categories is just as likely to have to deal with something like this also, and then it's on top of everything that I just said. So the key here is kind of, if you have privilege, it doesn't mean your life can't be hard. Everyone's lives are hard sometimes, but it's not hard because you have privilege. It's hard even though you have privilege. I'm not actually accusing you of being birds' rights activists, but some people are like this. How this affects you kind of depends on who you are. If you are like one of the people in one of the categories I just described, I'm sure that you're already kind of juggling your spoons every day, even if you're not thinking about it in that way. But I think it's really helpful to think about it because it's tiring managing your spoons, but it can also make you feel like, well, other people don't have to. And so I think thinking consciously about spoons is a really good lens to practice self-care. Self-care is super important. In fact, it's more than important. It's necessary. My friend Mary Thengvall gave a talk about burnout where she used this metaphor of putting your own oxygen mask on before helping others, and it really kind of changed my life to think about it that way. We're trained to feel like taking care of ourselves is selfish and that we should sacrifice our own well-being to please others, particularly in tech and startup culture. There's like a whole culture around that. But we can't give anything in life our best unless we make sure we're taken care of first. And a lot of people, I think that self-care looks like this, which sometimes it can, but I think self-care can also look like this. Like on days when I feel up to it, self-care can mean like holding myself accountable, getting stuff done that needs to get done, and feeling relieved about it. But on other days, it can mean giving myself permission to rest or ask for help, and forgiving myself if I don't get everything done. So the art of self-care is kind of being able to figure out which one you need at a certain time. If you're not one of the people that I was talking about, but you are like an employer or even just like a worker, like you have employees or coworkers that are dealing with this, I'm sure of it. And I'm hoping that this exercise that I did makes it very obvious why it's like a problem. You know, you want people to be refreshed and ready to start their day in the morning and get work done. And they're already spending a lot of energy before you even get there. So it is a productivity thing. But it's more than that too. Because hopefully you also care about your employees and your coworkers, and you want them to lead fulfilling lives. And it's not just work that's suffering here, because if you are using all your energy to stay afloat at your job, then it's like a work-life balance problem. Like there's not enough of them left at the end of the day. And that's a recipe that leads to burnout. Okay, so maybe I've convinced you, and you're like, Jamie, what am I supposed to do about it? Like, I can't fix these kind of problems for people in my workplace. Obviously not. But spoon theory is all about burden, and there are definitely things you can do, particularly as an employer, that will lessen people's burdens. Recognizing that their health is more important than their work. A lot of companies encourage this martyr complex thing, and so that's how I think it's gotten so pervasive. But it's not healthy to expect your employees to think of their work as the most important thing in their life. Healthcare is really important because not only is being sick tiring, but it's also really expensive and really stressful. So not only will good health care help people manage diseases, but it will also give them peace of mind, which will conserve energy. Let's all treat mental illness as a real illness. If you see someone who's freaking out and you think they're freaking out about nothing, trust me, they wish that they weren't more than you wish that they weren't. They can't help it. You can't help being sick any more than you can help having the flu. And make accessibility a priority. Nobody wants to be an afterthought. If you want to make your employees comfortable, you have to consider their needs before they have to come to you and ask for special considerations. If you plan things with accessibility in mind, not only will everyone feel more comfortable, but you won't have anyone feeling called out for asking for accommodations specifically. Accessibility is another thing we could do a whole talk on, but I'm talking about access to your building, all its facilities. Bathrooms are a problem for mobility, but also a big thing in the trans community. Thinking about events that people can enjoy, not trying to force people to do physical activities, think about their diet, do people drink, do you want to have alcohol? These are all just good considerations to keep in mind. And when you're keeping people's needs in mind, I think it's important to remember that fair doesn't always mean equal. You may not want to give the impression of giving special treatment to somebody, but people who have illnesses and other things going on in their lives need different considerations just to perform at the same level. If someone is late for work more or misses more work than someone who doesn't because they have an illness, or maybe they need to work from home more than someone else, being more lenient with them isn't special treatment. That's a consideration that they need. And also, there's an effect on productivity. So keep this in mind when looking at people's work. If someone isn't as productive as someone else, it could be because there's barriers caused by a situation, not because they're just not as smart or not as dedicated. There's this kind of trend the past couple years where sometimes men in tech will be like, I pretended to be a woman and I didn't think sexism was real, but now I do. And it's kind of annoying because they should just like believe it when people tell them about it. But it's kind of relevant because you might not even realize what kind of advantages you have. This is a story about someone who like switched with one of his coworkers and he was like, wow, my job is so much harder now. And she was like, oh, my job is so much easier now. So he learned empathy from this experience. But we can just take people's words about it without having to experience it for ourselves. Company culture is a phrase that makes me cringe because people tend to use it to justify a lot of crappy things I've been talking about. But you can also promote a company culture that's good and accepting and empathetic. So how do you do that? Actions speak louder than words. It's not good enough to just say that you want to have a good culture. You have to actually like back that up with what you do. I'm going to tell a brief story about my company. When I started working at Artemis, it was the first time I had started a new job since I had like been openly out as trans, and I was kind of nervous about it, even though everyone had been nice. You just never know what it's going to be like. And so it was my first day. I was filling out my paperwork. There was a gender question that I didn't know how to answer, and I was real nervous about it. And I was talking to the CEO. I'm like, I don't know, there's only 2 options. Should I put, my legal gender? Should I put, and she was like, I think it's 2017 and they should have more than 2 options on the form. And I was like, oh, nice, like she agrees with me. We're on the same wavelength, it feels good. But then she said, and in fact, I'm gonna email Trinet, our HR software, and tell them that I think they should add another one. And I was like, whoa, like she actually cares about, like she actually has my back enough to like do something about this. Spoiler, Trinet didn't change their thing from one person emailing them, but it still made me feel good that like my CEO cared about me to do it. Do not demand that minorities do all of the diversity work at your organization. If you want to do better, it may seem like a good thing to do to like ask marginalized people like to help educate you. How can I do better? The problem is that like most of us want to go about our day without doing a lot of free work, especially when we're already struggling to manage our spoons. I'm a huge exception to this. I always do education. I come and talk about it at conferences. But it's important for me to say it because like just because I will talk to you about being trans doesn't mean you can go ask any trans person you meet. So please don't. But on the other hand, do listen to people and believe their stories when they come to you with them. There's a culture of people not wanting to come forward with stories about being harassed or discriminated against because they feel like it won't be taken seriously. So to make people feel safe, you have to always take it seriously. There's a joke that all women in tech know each other, which is a joke, but it's also kind of true because word travels really fast if you're a jerk. But the converse is also true. Word will travel that you're not a jerk and that you've treated people well. And just don't tolerate crappy behavior. It sounds obvious, but if you say that you're not going to tolerate something and then you do, now you just like look untrustworthy and like you care more about looking like a good ally than actually helping people. So it turns out that like inaction also speaks louder than words. So it's really important to think about if your inaction is saying what you want it to say. This is a quote from my great friend Coraline Ada Emke, and she said, if you're not willing to remove a toxic contributor from your project, then you're accepting toxic behavior as a cultural norm, and there's really nothing you can do about it other than root that out of your organization. I have some recommended reading. I'll put these slides online if you want to click these links. This is the original Spoon Theory essay. There's a couple about illness and diversity. Monitoring the health of yourself is the Burnout talk that I mentioned. And then the crest for the rainbow bagel is Zach Anner has cerebral palsy. He made this video from the Cerebral Palsy Foundation about how hard it is to do like tasks, but it's also like he's a comedian. It's a funny video. But otherwise, thank you so much for letting me come and talk about this. I think it's really important, and I appreciate that DevOps Days also thinks it's important. Come talk to me after, find me on the internet. Thank you so much.